The man I loved stood outside a door he was never supposed to open. Inside, two people he trusted were laughing. And between the laughter they confessed to everything: the baby they swapped, the poison they used to destroy my marriage, and the murder they were planning next. His murder. Caspian did not move. He did not breathe. He just stood there in that hallway, frozen, listening to the two people who had already dismantled his marriage now plotting to take his life. And for the first time in 3 years, he understood what he had done to me. My name is Serafina, and this is the story of how I lost everything. My child, my husband, my life as I knew it, because the man I loved believed a lie over my truth. Let me ask you something. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you handed them the power to destroy you? Have you ever looked at the person lying next to you in bed and wondered, do I really know who this person is? Have you ever been so certain of someone's love that you missed every sign of their betrayal until it was far too late to do anything about it? Most of us have been there in some form. We trust doctors. We trust family. We trust the people who smile at us across the dinner table and swear they want what is best for us. We trust them because love demands trust, because connection requires vulnerability, because there is no other way to build a life with another person. But what happens when the person you trust most is working alongside someone else? Someone who wants to take everything from you? What happens when the woman who calls herself your husband's friend is actually his greatest enemy? What happens when the man sleeping down the hall from your children is not who he says he is at all? This is a story about a baby who was stolen from her mother's arms before that mother even knew she existed. It is a story about a marriage that was murdered from the inside by two people who smiled and lied, and played their roles so convincingly that no one suspected a thing until it was almost too late. It is a story about a woman who was poisoned, discarded, and divorced, all while grieving a child she never got the chance to know. And it is a story about a man who was so consumed by betrayal, a betrayal that was never real, that he destroyed the best thing in his life with his own hands. But here's what I need you to understand about lies. They work beautifully, efficiently, and completely until they do not. And the thing about truth has a longer memory than any lie ever could. It is patient, it is relentless, and it does not stop until it finds the light. The people who did this to me, Delilah, the woman who inserted herself into my husband's grief, and Thaddeus, the man she called her brother, they were calculated and they were careful. They planned every detail. They swapped my baby and made sure I would never know. They poisoned my marriage so methodically that by the time the damage was visible, it was already irreversible. They whispered in Caspian's ear until he looked at me like I was a stranger. Until everything we had built together meant nothing. Until the man who once told me I was his whole world handed me divorce papers without flinching. They thought they had won. They thought the story was finished. But what they did not count on was the truth having a longer memory than their lies. And they definitely did not count on me. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. If you are new here, I am so glad you found your way to this space. We tell real stories here. Stories about love and loss, and the kind of resilience that does not announce itself but shows up anyway when you need it most. If you have not subscribed yet, please do it now. And if you believe that the truth always finds its way, no matter how long it takes, no matter how deep it is buried, drop A in the comments right now. Because I promise you, this story is going to take turns you will never see coming. Serafina grew up in a 3-bedroom row house in West Baltimore. Her father worked 32 years at the same steel plant, leaving before the sun came up and returning after dark with calloused hands and a quiet kind of dignity that never asked for recognition. Her mother taught 2nd grade at a public school where she spent her own money on supplies because the district budget ran out before October every year. They were not wealthy people, but they were a family built on something more durable than money. They were built on love, on accountability, on the belief that how you carried yourself in the world mattered more than what you drove or where you lived. Serafina was raised to hold her head up in any room she walked into, to work harder than anyone expected her to, and to never, not once, let anyone make her feel small because of where she came from or what she looked like. She carried those lessons like armor. Because Serafina was a black woman navigating spaces that had not been built for her. Spaces filled with old money and older prejudice, where her presence alone was sometimes enough to shift the temperature of a room. She learned early how to read those shifts. She learned to feel assumptions forming before they were ever spoken. She learned that some people would smile at her warmly in public while questioning privately whether she belonged. She built walls. She built grace. She built the kind of quiet confidence that takes years to develop and cannot be manufactured. By the time she met Caspian Sterling, Serafina had spent a lifetime learning how to stand firm in spaces that wanted her to shrink. She had no idea that the greatest threat to everything she had built would not come from outside those spaces. It would come from inside her own home. They met at an art gallery in Manhattan on a Thursday evening in October. It was a Basquiat exhibition, Defacement, and Serafina had been standing in front of one particular piece for nearly 20 minutes, completely absorbed. There was always something about Basquiat that reached her in ways she struggled to put into words. The deliberate chaos, the beauty buried inside the noise, the way he forced people to sit with discomfort until they finally saw what he was actually saying. She did not notice Caspian at first, but she felt him. He was standing 3 feet to her left, and she became gradually aware of his attention, eyes moving between her face and the canvas, like he was genuinely uncertain which one deserved more of his focus. "You look at art like you are having a conversation with it," he said. Serafina turned. Gray eyes, a jaw that could have been carved. The particular kind of confidence that comes not from arrogance but from a lifetime of having every door open before you reach it. Everything about him announced wealth. The cut of his jacket, the watch on his wrist, the unhurried way he occupied space. And yet there was something beneath all of that. Something in the directness of his gaze. Something in the way he looked at her. Not through her, not past her, not with the veiled assessment she had grown so accustomed to in rooms like this one, but genuinely at her. Like she was the most interesting person in the building. "Maybe I am," she said. He smiled, and something shifted between them, quietly and permanently, in the space of that single exchange. Falling in love with Caspian Sterling was not a simple thing. It never could have been. When Serafina and Caspian built their relationship, they did not build it in a vacuum. They built it inside a world that had opinions about them. Sharp, persistent opinions that arrived from every direction. His mother, Cordelia, made her position known from the very first meeting. She was too practiced to say anything directly. Women like Cordelia operated through implication and omission, through the tightening of a smile and the careful selection of which questions to ask and which to conspicuously avoid. Serafina felt the disapproval like a low-grade current running beneath every interaction. She was being measured, assessed, and quietly found wanting. Not because of anything she had done, but because of what she represented to a woman who had spent decades protecting the Sterling bloodline from outside influence. Serafina's own family had a different kind of concern. They liked Caspian well enough. They saw how he looked at her, how he listened when she spoke, how he showed up consistently in the ways that mattered. But they also knew the world she was stepping into. They knew the history of black women who had loved wealthy white men and discovered too late that love alone was not sufficient insulation against everything that surrounded it. "Just be careful," her mother told her the night before the wedding. "Not of him, of everything around him." Serafina promised she would be. She kept that promise as best she could. It was not enough. When Serafina married Caspian, she stepped into a life that bore no resemblance to the row house in West Baltimore where she had grown up. The Greenwich estate sat on 47 acres of land so meticulously maintained it looked perpetually prepared for a photography session. 23 rooms spread across a main house that had been in the Sterling family for 3 generations. A staff of 12 who moved through the property with the quiet efficiency of people who had been doing this work long enough to anticipate needs before they were expressed. Gardens that Serafina eventually made her own, filling them with jasmine and roses and hydrangeas that bloomed in colors she chose herself. A wine cellar beneath the east wing that was older than her grandmother and twice as well preserved. She filled those 23 rooms with herself. Art from black artists she had discovered and championed. Pieces that belonged in museums, hung on walls that had previously held only portraits of Sterling ancestors. Books that mattered to her. Furniture she had chosen because it felt warm rather than because it looked expensive. She made that house a home. This is not mentioned to catalog what was lost, though everything was eventually lost. It is mentioned because the distance between a 3-bedroom row house in West Baltimore and a 47-acre estate in Greenwich is not only a distance measured in money, it is a distance measured in visibility, in expectation, in the weight of what it means to build something with your own hands, in a space that was never designed to hold you. Serafina built something real there, and the people who tore it down never once deserved to be inside it. Meadow was 5 years old when the world Serafina had built began to crack beneath her feet. She had warm caramel skin, lighter than Serafina's deep brown, richer than Caspian's pale complexion, and sandy 4 billion coils that framed her small face like a crown she had been born wearing. Her eyes were Caspian's gray, set into bone structure that mirrored Serafina's, and when she smiled, it was the kind of smile that made people in grocery stores stop and stare and forget what they had come in to buy. She was 5 years old, and she already had the kind of presence that filled a room the moment she entered it. Every morning, without exception, Meadow would climb out of her bed before the sun had properly risen and make her way down the hall to her parents' room. She knew exactly which floorboard creaked and stepped over it with exaggerated caution every single time, which made the exercise entirely pointless, but deeply endearing. She would push the bedroom door open slowly, assess whether her parents were awake, and then make her decision accordingly. If they were asleep, she climbed in anyway. She would wedge herself into the space between them, one small hand reaching up to touch Serafina's face, the other curled into the fabric of Caspian's shirt, and settle in with the complete satisfaction of a person who has arrived exactly where they intended to be. Mommy and Daddy sandwich, she called it. Serafina would lie there in those quiet early minutes, before the day made its demands, feeling the warmth of her daughter pressed against her side, and the steady rhythm of Caspian's breathing on the other, and she would feel something so complete and so fragile that she was almost afraid to name it. Meadow was the center of everything in that house. She was the reason Caspian left his phone on his desk when he came home instead of carrying it from room to room. She was the reason Serafina lingered in doorways watching her play, unable to move away. She was the gravity that held their family in orbit. Neither of them knew yet that she was also the instrument that would be used to pull everything apart. Caspian Sterling had not been built for softness. He had been raised in a family where success was the primary language and emotion was treated as a distraction from it. His father had been brilliant and distant. His mother, Cordelia, had been warm in the way that expensive things are warm. Beautiful to look at, carefully maintained, but not something you leaned into when you needed comfort. He had been sent to the right schools, given the right opportunities, and shaped into the kind of man who walked into rooms and immediately understood the power dynamics at play. He was, by every external measure, formidable, and then Meadow arrived, and he became someone else entirely. The transformation was not gradual. It happened in the delivery room, in the moment they placed that small, squirming, unimpressed human being in his arms, and he looked down at her face for the first time. He stood there holding her like she was made of something more precious than anything he had ever acquired in a boardroom, and something inside him that had been locked for 37 years simply opened. He became softer, not weak. The distinction mattered to him, but softer in the ways that made him genuinely better. He hosted tea parties in the garden with stuffed animals arranged in a careful semicircle around a plastic table. He sat through princess movie marathons of staggering length without complaint, allowing Meadow to paint his nails in colors with names like Mermaid Tears and Sunset Punch, and wearing those colors to breakfast the next morning without embarrassment. He learned the names of every character in every story she loved, and he discussed their motivations with the same focused attention he brought to quarterly earnings reviews. But the hair tutorials were what Serafina would remember most. Meadow's 4 billion coils required knowledge and care that Caspian simply did not have. Serafina managed the majority of her daughter's hair care, the detangling sessions, the deep conditioning, the protective styles that kept those beautiful curls healthy and defined. But Caspian decided, somewhere around Meadow's 3rd birthday, that he wanted to learn. He did not ask Serafina to teach him, because he wanted to figure it out himself before he tried it on his daughter. So he watched tutorials made by black women on YouTube, careful, detailed videos about moisture and porosity and sectioning techniques, and he took notes in a leather notebook he normally used for business. He bought a practice doll and kept it in the bottom drawer of his office desk, so no one would see him working through the process, fumbling with a rat-tail comb and rubber bands the size of his thumbnail. When he finally tried it on Meadow for the first time, the result was genuinely terrible. The parts were crooked. The sections were wildly uneven. One side had 4 sections and the other had 7. The whole construction listed slightly to the left. Meadow looked in the mirror and announced that she loved it. "Daddy braids," she named them. She wore them to preschool the next day and told everyone her father had done her hair. She wore them with the kind of pride that has nothing to do with aesthetics and everything to do with love. And every single night, for 47 consecutive nights, because Serafina counted, Caspian sat on the edge of Meadow's bed and read her Good Night Moon, the same book, the same words, in the same order, because she asked for it every night and he was constitutionally incapable of telling her no. That was the father Meadow knew. That was the man Serafina had married. The morning that everything began to unravel started the way the best mornings did, with the sound of small feet and the arrival of a 5-year-old who had already dressed herself in her pink tutu before anyone else in the house was properly conscious. Meadow appeared in her parents' doorway at 6:45, tutu in full effect, announcing that it was time for breakfast with the authority of someone who had given the matter considerable thought. They made their way downstairs to the sunroom, where the staff had laid out the morning meal: scrambled eggs, fresh fruit arranged in a bowl, orange juice in crystal glasses that caught the early light, a stack of pancakes that Meadow initially approached with great interest before abandoning them entirely in favor of using the sunroom floor as a stage. She spun in circles between the table and the windows, arms extended, the pink tutu flaring out around her like a small, joyful explosion. "Look at me, Daddy. I am a ballerina." Caspian set his coffee cup down on its saucer with deliberate care and turned his full attention to his daughter. He watched her spin. He watched her nearly lose her balance and recover with the absolute confidence of someone who has not yet learned to be embarrassed by imperfection. "You are the most beautiful ballerina I have ever seen," he said. And he meant it. That was the thing about Caspian. He was not a man who said things he did not mean, not to her, not to Meadow. There was no performance in it. He looked at his daughter spinning in the morning light, and he genuinely believed he was watching something extraordinary. Meadow beamed. She spun again. She came dangerously close to the orange juice, and Serafina caught the glass before it went over, and Meadow laughed the high, clear laugh of a child who finds the world mostly delightful. "Sorry, Mommy." Then she was spinning again. Serafina held the rescued glass and watched her family and felt the particular quality of happiness that only exists in ordinary moments, the kind you do not recognize as extraordinary until they are gone. Sitting in that sunroom, watching Meadow spin while Caspian smiled over his coffee cup, Serafina had one clear, complete thought. This is everything I ever wanted. Not the estate. Not the 47 acres or the 23 rooms or the staff of 12. Not the art on the walls or the gardens she had designed or any of the material architecture of the life she and Caspian had built together. This. The sunroom in the morning. Her daughter's laughter. Her husband's eyes, soft and unhurried, watching the little girl he loved without any of the weight of the world he carried the rest of the time. This was what she had worked toward. This was what she had fought through every whispered doubt, and every disapproving look, and every moment of feeling like an outsider in her own life to reach. She had won, or so she believed. She did not know that in 72 hours the life she was sitting inside would be unrecognizable. She did not know that the little girl spinning in the pink tutu would become the center of a nightmare that would strip away everything Serafina thought she understood about her own family. She did not know that Caspian, the man watching their daughter with such uncomplicated love, would soon look at Serafina like she was a stranger he had made the terrible mistake of trusting. She did not know that the child she had raised for 5 years, the child she had nursed through fevers and calmed through nightmares and loved with the totality of everything she had, was not the child she had given birth to. And she did not know that her real daughter, the baby she had carried for 9 months, the child of her blood, was living a life that looked nothing like this sunroom. She was living a life of cold floors and second-hand clothes, and a mother who looked at her like a problem to be managed, rather than a child to be loved. Serafina sat in the morning light and felt completely safe. She had no idea what was already in motion. It started so quietly that Serafina almost missed it entirely. Meadow was tired. That was the whole of it at first. Just tired. The kind of tired that any parent of a 5-year-old might dismiss without guilt, because 5-year-olds are busy, relentless creatures who run themselves into the ground regularly and then sleep for 12 hours and emerge the next morning as though nothing happened. One afternoon, Meadow came home from preschool and went directly to the couch instead of the playroom. She curled up with her stuffed elephant pressed against her chest and was asleep before Serafina had finished unpacking her backpack. Serafina covered her with a blanket and told herself it had been a big day. But it happened again the next afternoon, and the afternoon after that, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tiredness began to settle into Meadow in a way that felt different from ordinary childhood exhaustion. It felt heavier, more persistent. It was the kind of tired that sleep did not fix, that rest did not touch, that sat in the child's eyes even when she was awake and looking directly at you. Serafina noticed. Mothers always notice. Then came the color change, and this was when Serafina's concern sharpened from vague to specific. When you are a black mother with a brown-skinned child, you learn to read skin the way other people read text. You learn the difference between tired skin and sick skin. You learn to see what is not immediately obvious to people who have not spent years watching that particular shade of brown in particular light. Meadow's lips had gone ashy, not dry, not chapped, but the kind of pale grayish tone that does not belong on healthy brown skin. The warm undertone that should have lived in her nail beds had faded to something dull and slightly transparent. Around her eyes, there was a grayish cast that had no business being on the face of a healthy 5-year-old. Serafina knew what she was seeing. She did not know the name for it yet. She did not have the clinical language. But she knew in the way that mothers know things, through the body, through proximity, through years of watching that specific face in every possible kind of light, that whatever was happening to her daughter was not ordinary. She started watching more closely. She started paying attention to everything. Caspian saw it too, though he came to it differently. He came into Meadow's room one evening while Serafina was settling her for the night. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene. Meadow tucked into her canopy bed, Serafina smoothing the covers. And then he crossed the room and placed his hand on his daughter's forehead. His brow pulled together. "She feels warm," he said quietly, not wanting Meadow to hear the concern in his voice. "She has been tired," Serafina told him. "For almost 2 weeks now." He looked at Serafina over Meadow's head, and in that look was the unspoken acknowledgement that both of them had been watching, and both of them had been hoping the other would say everything was fine. Neither of them could say that. Something was happening to their daughter. They both knew it. The morning Meadow refused pancakes, Serafina stopped waiting and started acting. Pancakes were not simply a food item in the Sterling household. They were a ritual, a weekly ceremony that Meadow treated with the seriousness of a deeply held religious conviction. Every Saturday morning, she would appear in the kitchen before anyone else was awake and position herself at the counter to supervise the process, the mixing, the pouring, the careful monitoring of the griddle. She had opinions about blueberry distribution. She had a preferred level of golden brown. She ate them with a focused dedication that made the adults around her exchange amused glances. On the morning in question, Meadow sat at the breakfast table and looked at her plate. She did not reach for her fork. She did not negotiate for extra syrup. She simply looked at the pancakes with the vacant, uninterested gaze of someone who has forgotten what pancakes are for. "Baby," Serafina said carefully, "you love pancakes. I am not hungry, Mommy." She put her head down on the table. Serafina looked across at Caspian. He was already reaching for his phone to call the doctor. After the pancakes, things moved fast. Bruises began appearing on Meadow's arms and legs. Not the ordinary bruises of a child who falls off swings and runs into furniture, but bruises that bloomed without reason. Purple-brown marks against her golden skin that arrived without any corresponding injury, spreading and deepening in ways that had no explanation. Her appetite disappeared almost entirely. The child, who had previously approached every meal with enthusiasm, stopped eating. She would sit at the table and push food around her plate and ask to be excused after a few bites, and Serafina would let her go and then stand in the kitchen afterward feeling cold. The sleeping stretched longer and longer. 10 hours, 12, sometimes 14. And when Meadow woke from those long sleeps, she was still exhausted, moving through the house slowly, without her usual energy, without the brightness that had always defined her. The light in her eyes was fading. That was the only way Serafina could describe it to the doctors later. The specific, irreplaceable light that made Meadow herself was going dim, like a lamp on a failing circuit, and there was nothing Serafina could do to stop it. Their family physician, Dr. Fenimore, ran a comprehensive blood panel after Serafina brought Meadow in and described the full picture. When he called them back into his office 2 days later, his expression told Serafina everything before a single word was spoken. It was the expression of a man preparing to say something he wishes he did not have to say, carefully neutral, professionally composed, but not quite able to hide the gravity underneath. "Her counts are significantly abnormal across multiple markers," he said. "I am not in a position to diagnose what we are dealing with, but I am in a position to tell you that she needs to be seen by a specialist immediately." He slid a referral across the desk. "Dr. Rosalind Chen at Greenwich Medical, Pediatric Hematology. She is the best in the region, and I have already called ahead. She can see Meadow tomorrow morning." "Hematology?" Caspian said. "Her blood?" "Yes," Dr. Fenimore confirmed. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Dr. Rosalind Chen was precise and calm in the way that very good doctors learn to be, delivering devastating information with enough steadiness to keep the people receiving it from falling apart before she is finished speaking. She ran additional tests. She drew more blood. She ordered imaging. And then she sat across from Serafina and Caspian and told them what was wrong with their daughter. "Meadow has aplastic anemia," she said. "The severe classification. Her bone marrow is not producing adequate blood cells across all 3 categories: red cells, white cells, and platelets. The deficiency is significant." Serafina heard the words as though they were arriving from a great distance. "Without intervention," Dr. Chen continued, "her body will struggle to deliver oxygen to its tissues, fight infection, or clot properly when injured. The risk profile is serious." "What does treatment look like?" Caspian asked. His voice was steady, his hands were not. "The most effective long-term solution is a bone marrow transplant. In the immediate term, we want to stabilize her with transfusions while we assess donor compatibility. Parents are frequently our first point of evaluation." "Then test us," Serafina said. "Test both of us today." While they waited for the blood draw results, Serafina and Caspian sat side by side in the consultation room. She looked down at some point and realized their hands had found each other without either of them deciding to reach. Her fingers, dark brown against the pale of his knuckles. Both sets of hands holding on with the particular grip of people who are frightened and have nothing else to hold. They were terrified. But in that moment, sitting in that room with the antiseptic smell and the fluorescent light, they were still a unit. Still facing the same direction. Still choosing each other in the way that people who love each other choose each other when something real threatens what they have built. That unity would not survive the week. But it existed in that room, and it was real, and Serafina would remember it long after everything else was gone. When Dr. Chen returned to deliver the initial blood type results, Caspian leaned forward in his chair. "Whatever she needs," he said, "whatever the cost, whatever the process, whatever is required, you do all of it. You do everything available to you to make my daughter well." There was no hesitation in it, no calculation, just the absolute unconditional declaration of a father who would burn down the world before he let it take his child. Dr. Chen nodded. "The blood typing will help us understand our options," she said. "We should have preliminary results within a few hours." The results came back that same afternoon. Serafina, positive. Meadow, B negative. Caspian, B negative. Caspian was the match. His blood type aligned with Meadow's in the way they needed, which meant he could potentially serve as a donor for both transfusion support and, pending further testing, marrow donation. Serafina felt the first real loosening of the fear that had been sitting on her chest for days. There was a path forward. There was a way to help her daughter. For approximately 40 minutes, she believed that the worst was behind them. She was catastrophically wrong. Dr. Chen left the consultation room to review the cross-matching results. She was gone longer than she should have been. Serafina noticed the length of the absence first. She tracked the minutes without meaning to, her attention sharpening with each one that passed beyond what felt normal. Caspian was on his phone, responding to messages he had been ignoring all day. When Dr. Chen returned, she was not alone. She had brought 2 people with her. A woman Serafina did not recognize, and a man in a different kind of administrative lanyard than the clinical staff wore. Dr. Chen's expression had changed. The professional calm was still there, but something underneath it had shifted. Something in the set of her shoulders and the careful way she positioned herself before she began to speak told Serafina that the 40 minutes of relief had been the last she was going to feel for a very long time. "I want to introduce Dr. Pauline Webb," Dr. Chen said carefully. "She is our genetics specialist, and this is Mr. Hartley from hospital administration." Caspian looked up from his phone. Serafina felt the room change temperature. "Why do we need a genetics specialist?" Caspian asked. Dr. Chen drew a slow breath. "During the cross-matching process, we identified some irregularities in the blood markers that we needed to investigate further before we proceeded. Dr. Webb reviewed the results with our laboratory team." She paused. "I want to be straightforward with you both because I think that is what this situation requires." Dr. Chen looked at Caspian directly. "The cross-match results are not consistent with biological paternity. Your blood does not match Meadows in the way we would expect if you were her biological father." The room went completely silent, not the ordinary silence of a pause between sentences. Something heavier, something with mass and weight and edges. Serafina heard a sound that she realized after a moment was her own breathing. Caspian had gone absolutely still. That silence had a physical quality to it. It pressed against Serafina's chest. It filled the space between her and Caspian in a way that made the 18 inches separating their chairs feel like a vast and unbridgeable distance. She could not move. She could not find words. She could only sit inside that silence while something that had taken 7 years to build began to come apart at every seam, and there was nothing in the world she could do to stop it. Caspian turned to look at Serafina. Slowly, deliberately. And what she saw in his face was something she had never seen there before in 7 years of marriage. Not in arguments, not in their hardest seasons, not in any moment of conflict or disappointment or difficulty that they had navigated together. She saw suspicion, flat, cold, and absolute. He looked at her the way you look at someone when you are rearranging everything you thought you knew about them. When you are reconstructing the architecture of a relationship and finding, in the reconstruction, that it does not hold. He looked at her like she was a stranger. He looked at her like she was guilty. That is impossible. The words came out of Serafina before she had consciously decided to speak. "Caspian, that is impossible. You know me. You have known me for 7 years. You know that I would never— Please, just listen to me. Whatever those results say, I am telling you that I have never been with anyone else. Not before our marriage, not during it, not ever. You know me well enough to know that." He did not respond. He turned back to Dr. Chen. "I want a full paternity test," he said. "DNA, as many independent laboratories as it takes, and I want it done today." Dr. Chen confirmed it could be arranged. Caspian stood up. He did not look at Serafina again. He walked to the window and stood with his back to the room, looking out at the hospital parking lot, and the set of his shoulders said everything his voice was not saying. He had already decided. He had already convicted her. The test was a formality, not because he was open to being wrong, but because he needed the paperwork to confirm what he had already concluded in that first moment of silence. Serafina sat in her chair and watched the back of her husband's head and felt the floor disappearing beneath her. She sat alone in that consultation room for a long time after Caspian moved to the hallway to make phone calls. The doctors gave her privacy she did not know what to do with. And in that privacy, beneath the shock and the grief and the terror of watching her husband's face go cold, one question surfaced and would not go back down. If Meadow was not Caspian's biological daughter, and the blood work said she was not, then whose daughter was she? And if someone else's child had been placed in Serafina's arms in that delivery room 5 years ago, then where was the baby Serafina had actually given birth to? Where was her daughter? If your heart is already pounding right now, I need you to take a breath. Because if this story is already hitting you this hard, imagine being Serafina in that room. Imagine your husband looking at you like everything you built together was a lie. Imagine knowing you are innocent and having no way to prove it yet. If this story is moving you, smash that like button right now and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because what comes next changes everything. While the marriage deteriorated, Meadow got better. The transfusions worked. The treatment protocol Dr. Chen implemented began to take effect within the first 2 weeks, and the change in Meadow was visible and swift. The color came back to her skin, that warm caramel returning to her cheeks and her lips and her nail beds, the grayish cast dissolving like fog burning off in morning sun. Her appetite returned gradually and then all at once. She started asking for pancakes again. She started running through the house again. She started requesting Daddy braids again, climbing up onto her father's lap and presenting him with a comb and a bottle of leave-in conditioner in complete faith that he knew what he was doing. Caspian did them, mechanically, without the old warmth, but he did them because he could not yet bring himself to say no to her face. Meadow was healing. Her parents were not. Caspian moved to the East Wing without announcement or explanation. One evening his things were in their shared bedroom. The next morning they were not. His suits had migrated to the guest wardrobe on the opposite side of the house. His bathroom items were gone from the shared vanity. The indentation his body left in his side of the mattress was the only evidence he had ever slept there. He did not explain it. He did not discuss it. He simply moved himself to the far end of the house and reorganized his schedule so that their paths crossed as infrequently as possible. When they did cross paths, in the kitchen in the morning, in the hallway outside Meadow's room, at the dining table during the meals they still shared for their daughter's sake, he looked through Serafina like she was not there. Not with hostility. Hostility would have been easier to work with. He looked through her with the blank, exhausted vacancy of a man who had already done whatever grieving he intended to do, and was now simply waiting for the next procedural step. He had already ended the marriage in his mind. The paperwork was a formality. The DNA results came back on a Thursday morning. 3 separate laboratories, 3 independent analyses, all ordered by Caspian's attorneys with verified chain of custody and no possibility of cross-contamination or error. Every single result was identical. Negative. Caspian Sterling was not Meadow's biological father. 3 labs, 3 confirmations, no ambiguity and no room for alternative interpretation. Serafina sat at the kitchen table and read the results 3 times. She read them the way you read something you are hoping will change if you look at it long enough. The way you read something you cannot make sense of and keep returning to in the hope that the meaning will eventually shift. It did not shift. Negative, 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 3 verdicts for something that should have been impossible. Caspian found her in the library that evening. She had been sitting by the window watching Meadow in the garden below. Meadow and her nanny, playing some elaborate invented game that involved a great deal of running and at least one stuffed animal serving as a judge. Meadow was laughing. The sound came through the glass faintly, and Serafina had been holding on to it like a rope. Caspian walked in and placed a folder on her lap without preamble. 3 laboratories, he said. 3 independent results, all the same. Serafina looked at the folder. She did not open it. She already knew what was inside. She is not my daughter. He said it flatly, without inflection, the way you state a fact that has been verified beyond the possibility of dispute. Serafina stood up. I have never been with another man, she said. Not before you, not during our marriage, not once. I swear to you on everything I have, on Meadow, on my parents, on every year we have spent together, I have never betrayed you. Her voice was shaking. She could feel it shaking and she could not stop it. You know me, Caspian. Whatever those results say, you know me. You know what kind of person I am. You know what our marriage has been. He looked at her, and she saw it again. That flat, cold conviction that had been in his eyes since the hospital. He was not a man who was conflicted. He was not a man who wanted to be wrong. He had decided, and the decision had calcified into something she could not reach through. What happened next surprised her. The anger she had expected. The accusations. The cold, cutting words of a man who believed he had been betrayed. Instead, Caspian's face broke. Just for a moment, just long enough for her to see beneath the composure he had been maintaining for weeks. His jaw tightened. His hand, the hand holding the folder, trembled once before he controlled it. His eyes went bright, and then went flat again, and she understood that she was watching him force grief back down somewhere it would not show. I was there when she was born, he said. His voice was lower now. The flatness had a crack running through it. I held her. I counted her fingers. I was the first person to tell her she was loved. "I know," Serafina whispered. 5 years. 5 years of building something I believed was real." The crack in his voice widened, and then he shut it down. She watched him do it deliberately, watched him pull the composure back into place like a man closing a door on a room that is on fire. "She is still your daughter," Serafina said. She moved toward him. He did not move back, but he did not move toward her either. Biology does not change what you have built with her. It does not erase a single tea party or a single bedtime story or a single set of daddy braids. She loves you. She knows you as her father. That is real. That is more real than any DNA result. She reached for his arm. "Please, whatever you think I have done, please do not take it out on her. She is 5 years old and she does not understand any of this. She just knows that her daddy has been disappearing." Caspian looked at her hand on his arm. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he said the thing that broke her completely. "Every time she calls me daddy," he said quietly, "I will know it is a lie." Serafina let go of his arm. "Every time I look at her face, I will wonder whose face I am actually looking at. Every time I hold her, I will think about the man who fathered her. I do not have the capacity to pretend that information does not exist. Caspian, I need you to understand that I am not choosing this. I am telling you what is true about what I am capable of." He left. The door closed behind him without force. No slam, no dramatic exit, just the quiet, definitive click of a latch engaging, and then silence. Serafina stood in the library for a long time. Below the window, Meadow was still in the garden. Still laughing, still running, still completely unaware that the family she had been born into was dissolving around her. Serafina watched her daughter play and held the DNA results and said nothing and felt everything. That night, lying in the center of a bed that felt enormous and wrong, Serafina returned to the question she had first asked herself in the hospital consultation room. Not how Caspian could believe she had been unfaithful. She understood the mechanics of that, even if she could not accept them. She understood that the evidence, read at face value, told a story that made her the villain. She understood how he had arrived at his conclusion. What she could not understand, what kept surfacing through the grief and the anger and the exhaustion, was the deeper question underneath all of it. She had not been unfaithful. She knew that with the complete, unshakable certainty of a person who knows the contents of their own life. So if Meadow was not Caspian's biological daughter, and she was not, and if Serafina had never been with another man, and she had not, then what had actually happened? How had a child who was not Caspian's ended up in Serafina's arms in that delivery room? And where, in what life, in what circumstances, under whose care, was the child Serafina had actually given birth to? To understand what happened to Serafina's family, you have to understand Delilah Vance. Not the version of Delilah that Caspian believed he knew. Not the composed, remorseful woman who showed up at the right moment, with an apology and a daughter, and the perfectly calibrated appearance of someone who had made mistakes and grown from them. The real Delilah. Delilah Vance had entered Caspian Sterling's life years before Serafina did, during a period when Caspian was in his mid-20s, and still learning the difference between people who wanted him and people who wanted what he represented. They dated for 2 years. On the surface, the relationship looked like many relationships between young, ambitious people who move in the same circles. She was beautiful and socially fluent. She knew how to dress for the events that populated Caspian's world. She knew which conversations to join and which to observe from a careful distance. She laughed at the right moments and listened with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely interested. She catalogued his habits and his vulnerabilities. She noted which people he deferred to and which he dismissed. She paid attention to the shape of his trust, how it was earned, how it was maintained, and crucially, how it could be broken. She stored every piece of information about his family, his finances, his fears, and his desires in a mental filing system she had been building since long before she met him. Caspian, for his part, cared about her in the uncomplicated way of a man who has not yet been significantly betrayed. He was attentive and generous. He introduced her to his world without apology. And then Delilah pushed too hard. She began maneuvering toward marriage. not with the patience she would later develop, but with the urgency of someone who had not yet learned that wealthy men require a particular kind of handling. She made demands that revealed the calculation underneath the warmth. She issued ultimatums that told Caspian, in language he understood immediately, that he was not looking at love but at something that wanted to use love as leverage. He ended the relationship, cleanly and finally, or so he believed. Delilah did not end it. She simply changed her timeline. 6 months after Caspian and Serafina became serious, Delilah reappeared. She reached out through a mutual contact, carefully, indirectly, in a way that gave her plausible deniability if the approach was unwelcome. She said she needed to speak with him privately. She said it was important. She said it concerned something he had a right to know. When they met, she told him she was pregnant. The timing, she explained with the steady composure of someone who had rehearsed this conversation many times, placed conception within the final weeks of their relationship. Caspian's legal team moved immediately. A paternity test, they advised, was the only reasonable response to a claim of this nature from a woman with whom the relationship had ended badly. The timing was suspicious. The circumstances were designed to create maximum pressure. The legal team was unanimous in their recommendation. Caspian refused the test. He refused not because he believed Delilah's claim was genuine, but because the Sterling family name carried the weight of 3 generations of carefully cultivated reputation. A public paternity dispute, the legal filings, the press coverage, the social media commentary, would damage that reputation in ways that no subsequent resolution could fully repair. His mother Cordelia, who managed the family's public image with the precision of a military strategist, made her position absolutely clear. The situation needed to be resolved quietly, completely, and in a way that left no visible trace. The arrangement that emerged was straightforward. $200,000 annually, paid directly to Delilah for 5 years, in exchange for her complete silence, her removal from any public proximity to the Sterling name, and her agreement to raise the child without any claim against the Sterling estate. Caspian disclosed the arrangement to Serafina before their wedding. He sat across from her in his study and told her everything with the directness of a man who believed transparency was the foundation of an honest marriage. "There may be a child who is biologically mine," he said. "I am providing for her. I will not be in her life, but she will be provided for. I need you to know this before we stand in front of anyone and make promises." Serafina accepted it. She understood his world and the compromises it sometimes demanded. She trusted that the chapter with Delilah was genuinely closed. She had no way of knowing that it had never closed at all. $1 million. That was the sum total of what Caspian paid Delilah over 5 years to provide for the child she claimed was his. $1 million that could have built a life of genuine security for a child, that could have meant a safe home in a good neighborhood, quality health care, excellent schooling. Every material advantage that money can provide for a small person who did not choose her circumstances and deserved better than whatever Delilah decided to give her. Delilah spent it on herself. Not carelessly. Delilah was never careless with money, because careless people get caught, and getting caught was the one outcome her entire life was organized around avoiding. She spent it with the deliberate pleasure of someone who had worked very hard for something and intended to enjoy it completely. Designer pieces, first-class travel to places she photographed beautifully and posted with captions about living intentionally, restaurants where the bill for 2 people exceeded most families' weekly grocery budget, a wardrobe assembled with the same attention to detail that other people brought to investment portfolios. She documented it all. She looked extraordinary online. Her daughter did not feature in any of the photographs. Isolde was 5 years old, the same age as Meadow, born in the same hospital, in the same city, within hours of each other. But Isolde's 5 years had looked nothing like Meadow's. She lived in a cramped apartment that smelled of mildew and old takeout containers, in a building where the elevator broke regularly and the heat was unreliable in winter. Her bedroom was a converted storage room barely large enough for the mattress on the floor that served as her bed. Her clothes came from donation bins and secondhand sales, items that had belonged to other children first, that did not fit properly, that she wore without complaint because she had learned very early that complaints produced consequences she wanted to avoid. She was quiet in the particular way of children who have been taught that their presence is a burden. She moved carefully through the apartment, anticipating her mother's moods, staying out of the way when the moods were bad, making herself as small and unobtrusive as possible. At 5 years old, she cleaned up after herself without being asked, and often cleaned up after her mother too. She fetched things. She stayed silent during her mother's phone calls. She ate whatever was available without expressing preferences, because expressing preferences had taught her nothing useful. She was not loved. She was managed. She was kept alive and housed and fed in the most minimal sense of those words, and she understood somehow, with the terrible perceptiveness of neglected children, that she was not in the right place, that somewhere there was a life that should have been hers and was not. She was right about that. She was more right than she could possibly have known. When the questions about Meadow's paternity surfaced, Caspian's attorneys moved on multiple fronts simultaneously. One of those fronts was Isolde. Caspian had paid $200,000 a year for 5 years without ever requesting verification of the claim that had generated those payments. His legal team, now operating without the constraint of protecting him from information he had previously chosen not to have, arranged a DNA test through channels that required Delilah's cooperation. Delilah cooperated. She cooperated because refusing would have raised questions she was not yet ready to answer, and because she had already calculated that a positive result for Isolde served her purposes. A confirmed biological connection between Caspian and the daughter she had raised, even a daughter she had raised badly, gave her standing. It gave her access. It gave her a reason to re-enter his life that was harder to dismiss than a simple phone call. The results came back positive. Isolde was Caspian's biological daughter. He sat in his attorney's office and read the results and felt something he could not immediately name. A grief that was partly for the child who had been living that life while he lived his, and partly for the version of himself that had paid for her care, without ever once verifying that the care was actually happening. The full weight of the irony did not hit Caspian immediately. It assembled itself piece by piece over the days following the test results, arriving in stages that each carried their own particular devastation. For 5 years, he had been a devoted father to a child who was not biologically his. He had learned to braid her hair and read her the same bedtime story 47 consecutive times and host tea parties with stuffed animals arranged in careful attendance. He had loved Meadow with the uncomplicated totality of a man who did not know there was any reason not to. And for those same 5 years, his actual biological daughter had been sleeping on a mattress on the floor of a storage room in a building with an unreliable elevator. The child he loved was not his by blood. The child who was his by blood had never known what it felt like to be loved by him. He had been present for every milestone of one child's life and completely absent from the others. He had celebrated one and failed the other, not through cruelty or intention, but through a combination of other people's deception and his own decision years earlier to pay money instead of asking questions. Caspian was not a man who found it easy to sit with having been wrong. This particular wrongness was not something he could resolve with money or decisiveness, or any of the tools that had served him throughout his life. He had failed a child, and the full accounting of that failure was only just beginning. The change in Caspian after the DNA results was total and rapid. He withdrew from Meadow in a way that had no mercy in it for the child involved, because he was a man operating from inside his own pain, without sufficient space to consider the pain he was creating in someone else. He stopped coming to her room at night. He stopped doing her hair. When she called for him from another room in that bright, caring voice of hers, he flinched, a full-body response, involuntary and visible, and then removed himself from proximity to the sound. He worked later. He found reasons to be in his office. He scheduled early morning calls that required him to leave the house before Meadow woke up. He structured his days around the avoidance of a 5-year-old who had done nothing wrong and understood nothing of what was happening, who only knew that her father had become someone who was not there anymore. The East Wing bedroom, the separate schedule, the eyes that moved through Serafina without landing. He was not a cruel man by nature, but grief and betrayal had temporarily made him into someone who could be cruel without intending to, which sometimes causes more damage than cruelty with intent. What Serafina found hardest to witness was the way Caspian's gaze had changed when it fell on Meadow. Before the test results, he had looked at his daughter the way people look at things they cannot believe they are fortunate enough to have. Her caramel skin, her sandy 4 billions coils, the gray eyes that were his set into the face structure that was Seraphina's. He had celebrated all of it. He had talked about how perfectly she blended both of them, as though she were living proof that their love had made something neither of them could have made alone. After the test results, those same features became a source of pain. She could see him doing it, the involuntary inventory when he looked at Meadow, running the calculations, looking at the curl pattern in the skin tone and the bone structure, and trying to identify the man he believed had fathered her, looking for someone else in his daughter's face. Meadow noticed the looking, even if she could not name what she was seeing. Children notice everything. She started approaching him with more caution. She started checking his expression before she asked him things. She stopped running to him the way she used to, with the full-body abandon of a child who has always been caught. The daddy braid stopped. The bedtime stories stopped. And Meadow, who was 5 years old and had no language for what was happening to her, started being quieter in her own home. Delilah reappeared at precisely the right moment. This was not coincidence. Delilah did not operate in coincidences. She had been monitoring the situation carefully, through sources she had cultivated within the Sterling household over years of patient groundwork, and she knew exactly when Caspian was at his lowest point before she made her move. She reached out through his attorneys. Her message was brief and carefully worded. She wanted to apologize. She wanted to do better. She understood if he did not want to engage, but she felt she owed him honesty about the ways she had fallen short. When they met, she was everything the moment required her to be. Contrite without being groveling. Honest without being defensive. Warm without being inappropriately intimate. She spoke about her failures as a mother with enough self-awareness to seem genuine, and enough emotion to seem affected without seeming manipulative. "I kept Isolde from you because I was hurt," she said. "That was selfish, and it was wrong, and I have had to live with what that decision cost her. She deserved a father. You deserve to know your daughter." She brought Isolde to the second meeting. The little girl stood behind her mother's legs in the lobby of the restaurant Delilah had selected. A place public enough to feel safe, private enough for a real conversation, and peeked out at Caspian with wide, assessing eyes. Caspian crouched down to her level. Something in his chest cracked open and rearranged itself. This was his daughter, this quiet, watchful, too careful little girl who had learned to make herself small. He had a great deal to make up for. Delilah was a black woman. Seraphina was a black woman. Isolde was biracial. Meadow was biracial. On the surface, the parallels were striking, almost uncomfortably so. Two black women, two biracial daughters, a man positioned between them, trying to determine which story was true and which was the lie. But the way Caspian saw the two women could not have been more different. Delilah was the mother of his biological daughter, the woman who had come to him voluntarily, without legal pressure, to acknowledge what she had done wrong and ask for the opportunity to do better. In the story Caspian was currently living inside, she was the honest one, the one who had made mistakes from a place of human weakness rather than calculated deception. Seraphina was the woman who, in his version of events, had looked him in the eyes every day for 7 years while lying about something fundamental. He saw Delilah as a flawed person trying to make things right. He saw Seraphina as a betrayal he had not seen coming. Delilah understood exactly how he saw both of them. She had engineered it that way. Seraphina watched all of this from the inside, and there was nothing she could do. The problem was not simply that Caspian did not believe her. The problem was that everything she might say in her own defense sounded, to a man who believed he had evidence, like the predictable protests of someone who had been caught. "I never betrayed you." Of course she would say that. The test results must be wrong. Of course she would claim that. "I love you and I would never hurt you." Of course, of course, of course. Every true thing she could say was also the thing a guilty person would say. She had no counter-evidence. She had no explanation for the DNA results. She had nothing except her word. And her word had already been weighed against 3 laboratory reports and found insufficient. She tried anyway. She tried because the alternative was silence. And silence felt too much like surrender. But every conversation ended the same way, with Caspian's eyes going flat and his voice going quiet, and the door closing, literally or figuratively, between them. She could not reach him. And while she was failing to reach him, Delilah was already measuring the distance to the next step in a plan that had been in motion for years. Serafina did not know that yet. She was about to find out. Caspian said it over breakfast on a Tuesday morning in November. Serafina was at the counter, pouring coffee. Meadow was upstairs with her nanny, not yet down for the morning. The sunroom was full of the pale, thin light that came through the windows in November. Nothing like the warm gold of the morning Meadow had spun in her pink tutu, which felt like it belonged to a different life entirely. Caspian was at the table with his phone, and a plate he had barely touched. He did not look up. "I want a divorce." The same voice he used to discuss contractual terms in a meeting, the same register, the same absence of inflection, like the words carried no particular weight beyond their informational content. Serafina set the coffee pot down on the counter. She set it down carefully, because her hands were not entirely steady, and she did not want to break it. "Excuse me." "I've already spoken with the attorneys," he said. "The paperwork will be prepared by the end of the week. I wanted you to hear it from me before you heard it from them. 7 years. 7 years of building a life, and he ended it between a phone notification and an untouched plate of eggs without looking up from the screen. There had been a prenuptial agreement. Serafina had known about it from the beginning. Caspian had been transparent about its existence before they were engaged, framing it as a standard protection for a family with the kind of assets the Sterlings had accumulated over generations. She had signed it without significant objection, because she had not married him for his money, and the document's existence did not feel threatening when you had no intention of ever needing it to matter. But the prenup had not been written by Caspian. It had been written by Cordelia. Cordelia, who had managed the Sterling family's interests with the focused intensity of someone who understood that wealth requires active protection. Cordelia, who had never wanted Serafina in the family, and had used the prenuptial agreement as the instrument through which she ensured that if Serafina ever left, or was made to leave, she would leave with the absolute minimum the law required. Every term, every clause, every carefully worded condition had been designed by a woman who had spent years anticipating this exact outcome. Serafina had signed it because she trusted her marriage. Cordelia had written it because she trusted nothing. The settlement was delivered with the same absence of emotion that had characterized everything Caspian had done since the hospital. One property, the Vermont country house, a drafty, rarely visited estate that had been sitting largely unused for years. His choosing, not hers. A 5% share in Sterling Holdings, non-voting shares, carefully structured so as to provide a nominal financial interest while conferring no actual influence over anything. A lump sum of $500,000. That was the totality of it. 7 years of marriage to one of the wealthiest men in the country. 7 years of building a life inside the Sterling world, of filling 23 rooms with art and meaning and warmth, of being a wife and a mother and a partner in every sense of the word. $500,000, 5% of nothing, and a house in Vermont that needed work she was not sure she had the energy to do. Cordelia had designed those terms a decade ago for exactly this purpose. She had gotten what she designed them to get. Serafina did not fight the settlement. She understood that fighting would require resources, legal resources, emotional resources, time, that she was not certain she had. She understood that fighting would extend contact with a process that was already costing her more than she could afford to lose, and she understood, with the clear-eyed practicality of a woman who had grown up watching her parents navigate the world without a safety net, that some battles are not about winning, but about surviving. She signed the documents. But before she did, she stood in the doorway of what had been their shared bedroom and looked at Caspian, who was standing across the room watching her with the careful blankness he had perfected over the past weeks. "I never cared about your money," she said. He looked at her. "I want you to know that, whatever you believe about what I did or did not do. I want you to know that I married you because I loved you. I stayed because I loved you, and I am leaving now because you have already left. And I am not going to stand in a house where I have been convicted of something I did not do." He did not respond immediately. But something moved behind his eyes, something that was not quite the flat conviction that had been there for weeks. It was there for only a moment, and then it was gone. She saw him, in that moment, before the blankness returned. Not the Caspian who had walked away from her in that hospital consultation room. Not the man who moved through their house like a stranger wearing her husband's face. The original Caspian. Exhausted, hollowed out, carrying a grief so heavy it had bent him slightly at the shoulders. He looked like a man who had made a decision he could not unmake and was beginning, in the deepest and least accessible part of himself, to suspect that the decision had been wrong. But suspicion was not enough. Not yet. He had built the conviction too high and too solid to dismantle on the strength of a feeling, particularly a feeling he would have interpreted as weakness. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked away. And Serafina understood that whatever he had been about to say was going to stay unsaid, because he was not yet the man who could say it. She asked him one thing before she left that room. Is she the reason? She did not use Delilah's name. She did not need to. He was quiet for long enough that she had her answer. That is not, he began. You do not have to explain it, she said. I just needed to know. She picked up the folder with the signed documents. She walked out of the room, and he let her go. The divorce was finalized in 6 weeks. 6 weeks to legally dismantle 7 years. The legal process moved with the efficient speed of proceedings where both parties are represented by expensive attorneys, and neither is contesting the fundamental terms. Serafina received what the prenup entitled her to. Caspian received what he had asked for. The court received its filing fees, and Meadow came with Serafina. Caspian did not contest custody. He had the legal standing to contest it. He had the resources to mount a challenge that could have dragged on for years. But to contest custody of Meadow would have required him to claim her as his own in a legal context. And he was not, in those weeks, capable of doing that. He told his attorneys to make the custody arrangement clean and uncontested. Serafina got Meadow. She would have fought the entire world for that outcome. She did not have to. The day she left the Greenwich estate, Serafina packed what mattered. Not the furniture, not the pieces she had collected over 7 years. Those were complicated in the settlement, and she did not have the energy to fight for things. She packed her clothes and Meadow's things, and the art she had bought with her own money before the marriage, and a box of photographs, and the recipe book that had belonged to her grandmother. She strapped Meadow into the back seat. Meadow was holding her stuffed elephant and wearing her pink sneakers and had been told they were going on an adventure. What kind of adventure, Mommy? The kind where we make a new home, Serafina said. She pulled out of the driveway and down the long approach road that led from the main house to the estate gates. The gardens she had designed were on both sides. Roses and jasmine and hydrangeas she had planted herself in the first year of the marriage, things she had chosen because they were beautiful and because they were hers in some way that the house itself never quite was. She looked at them through the windshield as she passed. She did not look in the rearview mirror. She did not look back at the house. Some things you cannot afford to look back at. 3 days later, a woman she knew only by reputation arrived at the Sterling estate with 12 suitcases, a personal assistant, and the particular confidence of someone who has been planning an entrance for years. Delilah Vance moved into the house that Serafina had spent 7 years making into a home, and began the process of making it into something else. The staff told Serafina later. One housekeeper, who had worked at the estate for 9 years, and felt the loyalty ran deeper than her current employment, that Delilah walked through the front door and began pointing at things. The art on the walls, the furniture Serafina had chosen, the small details that had accumulated over years of someone living genuinely inside a space, pointing at them, deciding what would stay and what would go. And somewhere in a house that used to belong to her, Serafina understood, another woman was measuring the windows for new curtains. Delilah moved in 3 days after the divorce was finalized. 3 days. She had not waited for a polite interval. She had not given the house time to settle after Serafina's departure. She had a timeline, and sentiment was not a variable she had factored into it. 12 suitcases arrived in 3 separate carloads. A personal assistant, young, efficient, carefully chosen for discretion, managed the logistics of the move with the organized speed of someone who had done this before, which, in a sense, she had. Delilah's assistants learned quickly that efficiency was the primary job requirement, and that questions were not encouraged. The staff of the Sterling estate absorbed Delilah's arrival with the professional neutrality that their employment required. But they noticed things. They noticed that she moved through the house with the ease of someone familiarizing herself with territory, rather than someone entering it for the first time. They noticed that she opened the wrong drawers and found the right things. They noticed small moments of familiarity that should not have existed in someone who had never, as far as any of them knew, spent significant time in the house. They kept what they noticed to themselves. For now, in Caspian's presence, Delilah was extraordinary. She had always been a gifted performer, but the years had refined her considerably. She understood Caspian's rhythms, when he needed space and when he needed company, when he wanted to talk, and when he wanted someone to simply be present without demands. She had spent years studying him, and that study paid dividends now in the form of an instinctive attunement that felt, to him, like genuine compatibility. She was warm but not overwhelming, attentive but not suffocating. She cooked for him, nothing elaborate, just the kind of food that says someone thought about what you might need rather than what might impress you. She listened when he talked about Meadow, and the pain of the DNA results, and the collapse of his marriage. And she listened with the active, empathic attention of someone who understood that a grieving man does not need solutions. He needs to feel heard. She never pushed. She never asked for things he had not offered. She made herself indispensable by degrees, so gradually that Caspian could not have identified the moment it happened. That was the point. The idea of marriage did not arrive as a suggestion. It arrived as a question dropped casually into an ordinary evening conversation about 6 weeks after she moved in a tone that implied she was thinking aloud rather than making a case. "Do you think you would ever want to try again?" she asked. "Marriage, I mean. Or has everything that happened put you off the idea entirely?" She was not looking at him when she asked it. She was looking at something across the room, which made the question feel less directed, less weighted. Caspian was quiet for a moment. "I do not know," he said. That was enough. She filed his answer away and did not return to the subject for another 3 weeks. When she did, it came from a slightly different angle, delivered with the same apparent casualness. The subject never appeared on her agenda. It was never something she seemed to be pursuing. It was simply something that floated through conversations and lodged itself gently in his thinking, the way truly effective ideas do. Not through pressure, but through presence. She was patient. She had been patient for years. She could afford to be patient for a few more months. The request about Thaddeus arrived on an evening when Caspian was in a good mood. Isolde had spent the afternoon at the house, and the visit had gone well, and he was sitting with the uncomplicated satisfaction of a man who feels like he is doing something right. Delilah chose her moments carefully. "I need to ask you something," she said, settling onto the sofa with a relaxed ease she had perfected, "and I want you to say no if it does not work for you. I mean that genuinely." He looked at her. "My brother Thaddeus is going through a difficult stretch. He is between positions right now, and the situation with his last place fell through rather suddenly. He needs somewhere to land for a little while, a few months, maybe a bit more, depending on how the job search goes." She paused. "I know this is a lot to ask. This is your home, and I do not want to impose, but he is my family, and I would not ask if I thought it would cause any kind of problem." Caspian considered it for approximately 30 seconds. "Of course," he said. "This house has more rooms than either of us could use. If he needs a place, he should come." Delilah smiled. "Thank you," she said. "He will not be any trouble." Caspian did not think twice about the decision. He was a man who had grown up with resources that made generosity easy, and the request fit cleanly within the version of Delilah he had constructed. A woman trying to rebuild her life. Someone who took family seriously. Someone whose mistakes had been born of human weakness rather than any darker motive. A brother who needed temporary accommodation was not a complicated ask. 30,000 square feet of house. 12 staff members. Grounds large enough to walk in without crossing another person's path for an hour if you chose your route carefully. There was plenty of room. He texted his estate manager that evening to prepare a guest suite in the north wing. He did not know that the man he was preparing a room for was not related to Delilah by any measure. Not blood, not law, not any history that bore any resemblance to the story she had told. He did not know that the man arriving was her partner of 10 years. And he did not know that the guest suite he was having prepared was the latest staging ground in a con that had already claimed lives. Thaddeus was not Delilah's brother. He had never been her brother. They had met 11 years earlier, in circumstances that neither of them described accurately to anyone, and within a year of meeting they had identified in each other something that made them more dangerous together than they had ever been separately. Delilah had the warmth, the social intelligence, the ability to construct whatever version of herself a situation required, and inhabit it so completely that inconsistencies became invisible. Thaddeus had the patience, the logistical precision, the ability to plan across long timelines without losing the thread or getting distracted by impatience or emotion. Together they had run variations of the same fundamental scheme across multiple cities and multiple targets over the course of a decade. The specifics varied, different cover stories, different approaches, different timelines depending on the target, but the architecture was always the same. Identify a wealthy man, gain proximity, establish trust, extract money, disappear before the consequences arrived. Caspian Sterling was not the first. He was the largest, and the scheme they had constructed around him was the most elaborate thing they had ever attempted. The half-sibling cover had been constructed with enough internal logic to withstand casual scrutiny. Different fathers, a detail that explained the obvious visual contrast between them without requiring any documentation. A blended family background, common enough to require no further explanation. A childhood relationship close enough to produce genuine sibling-level familiarity without the kind of shared family history that might be verifiable through people who actually knew them. They had told the story enough times that they told it consistently, and without the micro-hesitations that reveal fabrication. They had worked out the details, the holidays they had spent together, the shared memories, the mutual friends they referenced with the ease of people describing real experiences. When Caspian met Thaddeus, the story was delivered exactly as rehearsed. Different fathers, same mother, grew up close despite everything. Caspian had no reason to question it. There was a bitter irony embedded in the fact that Caspian accepted the cover story without scrutiny. Caspian was a man who had spent 7 years in an interracial marriage. He understood, better than most men in his world, that families do not look like matching sets. He had navigated the social complexity of being a white man married to a black woman and raising a biracial daughter in spaces that still found the configuration worth commenting on. He was, in short, exactly the kind of person who would not find a racially mixed sibling pair unusual or suspicious. Delilah knew this. She had known it when she designed the cover story. She had taken something real about him. His openness, his experience, his resistance to making assumptions about families based on appearances, and she had used it as a weapon against him. The very thing that made Caspian a decent man made him a better target. Thaddeus walked into the Sterling estate without a single serious question being raised, and the final stage of the plan began. Thaddeus arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in early spring. He stepped out of the car in the circular driveway of the Sterling estate and stood for a moment, looking at the house. He was tall, dark-haired, the kind of unremarkably good-looking that reads as trustworthy. A face without strong enough features to be threatening but with enough definition to be taken seriously. He had cultivated an ease of manner over years of practice, until it sat on him completely naturally, indistinguishable from the genuine article. He looked at the 47 acres and the main house and the staff member who had come out to help with his luggage, and whatever was moving through his mind was not visible on his face. His face showed exactly what it was supposed to show, a man arriving at a place of temporary refuge with appropriate gratitude and no particular agenda. He had one bag. He traveled light. People who plan to leave quickly always do. Caspian met him in the marble foyer, 2 men shaking hands in an entrance hall that had been in the Sterling family for 3 generations. One of them had built things, businesses, relationships, a family, with genuine investment and genuine risk. The other had spent a decade dismantling what other people built, extracting value and leaving wreckage. The handshake lasted 3 seconds. "I appreciate it more than I can say," Thaddeus replied. "This is genuinely generous. I will try not to disrupt anything." His voice was warm. His eye contact was steady. His handshake was firm without being competitive. He was very good at this. He had been doing it for a long time. The first weeks of Thaddeus's residence at the Sterling estate produced nothing that attracted attention. He was present but not intrusive. He joined meals when invited and made himself absent when the space seemed to call for it. He engaged Caspian in conversations about business and current events with enough knowledge to be interesting and enough deference to avoid, seeming like a challenge. He was pleasant to the staff. He was warm with Isolde when she visited. He was, by every visible measure, exactly what Delilah had described, a man going through a difficult patch, a brother leaning on family while he sorted things out. No one looked more closely. No one had reason to. 300 miles away, Serafina was discovering something she had not expected to find in a drafty country house she had visited exactly twice during her marriage. The previous owners had installed a commercial kitchen. They had been caterers, a husband and wife team who had run a small catering operation out of the property for 15 years before selling it to the Sterling estate as a second home that was subsequently used for almost nothing. They had invested in professional-grade equipment before they left, and it had sat largely unused ever since. Industrial ovens, stainless steel prep surfaces that ran the length of 2 walls, commercial refrigerators, storage that could accommodate the kind of volume that home cooking never required. Serafina walked into that kitchen on her 3rd morning in Vermont when Meadow was still asleep, and the house was quiet, and she was looking for something to do with herself that was not lying in bed thinking. She stood in the center of the kitchen. She looked at the equipment. And for the first time since the hospital, since the DNA results, since the drive away from Greenwich with Meadow asleep in the back seat and the estate shrinking in the mirror she refused to look at, for the first time in months, she felt something that was not grief. She felt possibility. Serafina's grandmother, Grandma Opal, had taught her to bake before she had learned to read with any confidence. Grandma Opal did not measure things. She had long since translated every recipe into the language of her body. A pinch that was actually a specific pinch. A handful that was always exactly the right handful. A little more that was calibrated by decades of repetition into something precise and unrepeatable. She baked by feel, by smell, by the look of a batter and the sound of a crust and the particular give of a dough under her palm. Her sweet potato pie was not simply good. It was the kind of food people talked about long after the occasion that produced it, the kind of food that became a family memory rather than just a meal. People planned around it. People drove distances for it. People called her in October to make sure they were on the list for Thanksgiving. Her biscuits made grown men emotional. Baking is love made solid, Grandma Opal used to say, standing at her kitchen counter in the West Baltimore house with flour on her forearms and complete certainty in her voice. Every loaf, every pie, every cake, you are giving people something real to hold on to, something made with intention. Never underestimate that. Serafina had not baked seriously in years. The Sterling household had a full kitchen staff, and she had stepped back from the practice gradually, the way you step back from things when life provides alternatives, and you do not realize what you are losing until it is already gone. Standing in the Vermont kitchen that morning, she heard her grandmother's voice as clearly as if Grandma Opal were standing next to her at the prep counter. She opened the pantry. She found flour. She started. The bakery opened 6 months after Serafina arrived in Vermont, in a commercial space on the main street of a small town that had, as far as she could determine, never seen a business, quite like the one she was proposing to open. She called it Serafina's. Just her name. Nothing else. Because the name was hers, completely and without qualification, and she was done with things that qualified or diminished or required explanation. She was the only black-owned business in town. She was the only business owned by someone who had not been born and raised in this particular corner of Vermont, where people knew each other's grandparents, and the arrival of someone genuinely new was an event worth discussing at length. She knew it would be difficult. She had been navigating spaces that were not designed for her since before she could articulate what that meant. She opened anyway. The first 3 months were hard in the specific way that honest work is hard when you are building something from nothing in a place that has not decided yet whether it wants what you are offering. People walked past the window. They looked in, registered that the person behind the counter was not someone they recognized, and kept walking. A few came in out of curiosity and left with polite non-comments that said nothing about whether they would return. A few made remarks loud enough to be heard that she chose not to respond to, because she was building something, and the building required energy she was not going to spend on people who had already decided. She kept baking. She put samples on a table outside the door, sourdough, sweet potato pie, biscuits, honey cake, and she smiled at everyone who passed whether they stopped or not. She introduced herself by name to every person who came within conversation distance. She learned the names of the townspeople and used them. She showed up before dawn and stayed after dark, and put everything she had and everything Grandma Opal had taught her into the food that came out of that commercial kitchen. One customer became a regular. That regular brought a friend. The friend brought her family. The family mentioned it to people they knew. The sourdough developed a reputation that spread beyond the immediate radius of people who had reason to walk past the storefront. People started driving in from neighboring towns. People started placing advance orders for the sweet potato pie. The food did what Grandma Opal always said food would do. It made people feel something real. And real is harder to dismiss than anything else. The write-up in New England Living arrived in the bakery's 8th month of operation and changed the scale of everything. A food blogger had posted about the sweet potato pie 6 weeks earlier, a post that had traveled further and faster than anyone anticipated, picked up by food accounts with significant followings, and shared with the kind of enthusiasm that genuine discovery generates. The New England Living journalist had seen the post and driven up on a Tuesday, unannounced, and spent 3 hours in the bakery eating and talking to Serafina and watching how the space functioned. The article ran with a photograph of Serafina at the prep counter and a headline that described the bakery as the most important food destination in the region. Within 2 weeks of publication, the line outside extended past the neighboring storefronts on weekend mornings. Serafina hired staff. She extended hours. She negotiated with her landlord about the adjacent space that had been vacant for 2 years. The business was becoming something real and durable. By every external measure, she was thriving, but the nights were long. The bakery closed at 6, and Meadow was in bed by 8:30, and after 8:30 the Vermont house was very quiet in a way the Greenwich estate had never been, even when it was supposed to be quiet. Even in the middle of the night, that house had always had the sense of life in it. Staff in the kitchen. Caspian working late in his study. The sounds of a large house fully inhabited. This house held only the two of them, and when Meadow was asleep, Serafina was alone with thoughts she did not always have the tools to manage. She braided Meadow's hair before bed every night, working through the 4 billions coils slowly, carefully, section by section, the way she had always done, and she hummed hymns her grandmother had taught her while her hands worked. Meadow would sit still, and occasionally chime in on the parts she knew, her small voice carrying the melody in the approximate way of a child who has heard something enough times to feel it, if not yet to reproduce it perfectly. Those were the best moments of the day. After them came the quiet. For the first 4 months after the divorce, Serafina called Caspian's number. She did not do it with the expectation of an answer. She was not sure she would have known what to say if he had picked up. She called because the sound of his voice, even recorded, even the 12-second voicemail greeting, was a form of connection to the life that had been taken from her. "You have reached Caspian Sterling. Leave a message." She listened to those words more times than she would ever admit to anyone. Sometimes she left messages, brief ones, about Meadow mostly, a funny thing she had said, a milestone, something she had done that he would have loved to see. Messages that were not arguments or appeals but just information, offered without expectation. Sometimes she just listened to the greeting and ended the call without speaking. The number was disconnected sometime in the 5th month. She stopped calling. Every night after Meadow was asleep and the house was quiet and the last of the day's work was done, Serafina got on her knees. The way Grandma Opal had taught her, beside the bed, hands folded, in the particular posture that was not about performance but about the physical act of humbling yourself before something larger. She talked to God the way Grandma Opal had always talked to God. Directly, without formality, like a conversation with someone who was in the room and paying attention. She talked about the pain, about Meadow growing up without her father, about the loneliness that gathered in the quiet house after 8:30, about the injustice of being blamed for something she had not done and having no way to prove it that anyone would accept. She talked about forgiveness, not because she had achieved it, but because she was working toward it and wanted credit for the working, even if the arrival was still a long way off. She asked for strength. She asked for clarity. She asked, more nights than not, for the truth to find its way into the light, for whatever had actually happened to her family to eventually reveal itself completely, so that at minimum she could understand, even if understanding did not restore anything that had been lost. She did not know that her prayers were already in motion. She did not know that 300 miles away, in the mansion she had left, a man's patience was being worn down by a suspicion he could not name into something that was about to break open. She did not know that the truth she had been praying toward was about to announce itself. She kept praying anyway, because that was what Grandma Opal had taught her. You keep going. You do the work. You trust the process even when the process hurts, and you do not stop until the answer comes. If Serafina's strength is reaching you right now, if something in this story is sitting with you in a way that feels personal, type "Stay strong" in the comments right now. And if you know someone going through something difficult, someone who feels like the world has turned against them and they cannot find solid ground, share this with them. Sometimes a story is exactly what. Someone needs to remember that surviving is not the same as losing. Now let me tell you what Caspian found when he went back to that house. The man Caspian Sterling had become in the year following his divorce was not a man who trusted easily. The betrayal, as he had understood it, had fundamentally altered something in his processing of the world. He had always been a careful man in business, a man who read contracts thoroughly and verified information before acting on it. But in his personal life he had operated from a baseline of trust, the kind that comes from having been raised with enough security to extend good faith to people without the constant calculation of risk. That baseline was gone. In its place was a vigilance that he had initially mistaken for wisdom, and had only gradually begun to recognize as something less healthy. He watched people differently now. He heard subtext in ordinary conversations. He noticed inconsistencies that a year earlier would not have registered. He told himself it was necessary. He told himself that he had been too trusting before and that this new attentiveness was the corrective. He was not entirely wrong about that. But the vigilance, when it finally turned toward Delilah and Thaddeus, was about to show him something that would make the betrayal he had believed in for a year look like a minor grievance by comparison. The recording equipment had been installed 6 weeks after Thaddeus arrived. Caspian had told himself it was a security measure, a reasonable precaution for a man who had recently discovered that his most intimate life had been built on deception. Voice-activated devices in the main living areas, the hallways, the kitchen, places where household life happened. Not in bedrooms, not in bathrooms, just the common spaces where people moved through during the ordinary course of a day. His security consultant had handled the installation. His security consultant asked no questions. Caspian had checked the recordings irregularly over the weeks since installation. Occasionally, without particular expectation, the way you check something you installed because it seemed prudent, rather than because you had reason to believe it would produce anything significant. For 6 weeks, it had produced nothing significant. That was about to change. It was a Thursday. Caspian left the house at 7:15 in the morning, briefcase in hand, on his way to a 10 o'clock meeting that required a file he had reviewed the previous evening and left on his study desk. He realized he had forgotten it somewhere on the approach road, before he reached the estate gates. He turned around. The drive back took 9 minutes. He parked on the side of the house, rather than in the main circular drive out of no particular reason beyond habit. The side entrance was closer to the study staircase. He let himself in through the side door. The house was quiet. The morning staff were in the kitchen wing on the opposite end of the property. Isolde was at school. Delilah and Thaddeus were, as far as he knew, wherever they were when he was not present. He moved through the ground floor hall toward the study staircase. And then he heard something that made him stop. Voices coming from upstairs. This was not in itself unusual. The master suite was on the second floor, and Delilah occupied it. Thaddeus had been placed in the north wing guest suite, which was on the same floor but a substantial distance from the master. The voices were not coming from the north wing direction. They were coming from the master suite. And beneath the voices there was laughter, the particular unguarded laughter of people who believe they are completely alone and feel no need to manage how they present themselves. Caspian stood at the bottom of the staircase. He was a careful man, a newly vigilant man. He went up. The door to the master suite was not fully closed. It sat open perhaps 3 inches, enough to carry sound into the hallway clearly, enough to confirm that both voices were coming from inside the same room. Caspian positioned himself against the wall outside the door. He did not announce himself. He did not reach for his phone. He stood completely still in his own hallway, and he listened to the two people on the other side of that 3-inch gap speak with the total freedom of people who are certain they are not being heard. "He is such a gullible fool." Thaddeus's voice, relaxed, amused, the voice of a man who is comfortable where he is and confident in what he is saying. "I have spent months in this house, and he has not questioned a single thing. Not one. The man had a recording system installed 6 weeks ago, and he is still inviting me to dinner. He genuinely believes I am your brother." Caspian's body went very still. "He is exactly the profile we look for," Delilah responded. "Intelligent in business, completely undeveloped when it comes to personal risk assessment. They are always the most straightforward." But it was not only what she said. It was the voice she said it in. Because the woman speaking on the other side of that door was not the woman Caspian had been sharing a house with for the past 8 months. The warmth was gone. The measured, empathic tone she used when she spoke to him, all of that was gone. What remained was something entirely different. Harder, flatter, the voice of a person who had set down a costume they have been wearing all day and is finally comfortable, raw, unperformed, real. Caspian had never heard this voice before. He understood immediately, with a part of him that had always been good at reading rooms, that this was the only version of Delilah Vance that actually existed. Everything else had been theater. "How long has it been total?" Thaddeus asked. "Since we started working together? 11 years? Since we started this specific approach? 10. And Sterling is what, the 6th? The 7th. Richards was between Marcus and the Seattle situation. You forget Richards. Richards was barely worth counting." "Richards kept us operational for 8 months, Delilah said. "He counts." Caspian's mind was working rapidly, absorbing and filing information with the processing speed that had made him effective in business for 20 years. 7 targets. He was the 7th. "Where are we on the timeline?" Thaddeus asked. "He is ready for the proposal conversation. I have been running the groundwork for 4 months. He has mentioned the future twice in the past 3 weeks without me introducing the subject." "No prenup?" "Absolutely not. I have had 6 months of conversations positioning prenups as the instrument that destroyed his first marriage. He will not propose one. He will consider it a sign of good faith not to." "And the will?" 3 months after the wedding. No earlier. It needs to look organic. A newly married man updating his estate documents is not unusual. A man who updates his will 2 weeks after the wedding raises questions. 6 months after that? Maybe 8. Depends on his health baseline and how quickly we want to move. "St. Kitts is ready," Thaddeus said. "I know. I checked the accounts last week." "New documentation?" "Complete. Both sets. We will not be Delilah and Thaddeus when we get off that plane." "And the girl?" There was a brief pause. "Which one?" "Meadow, the one in Vermont." Caspian's entire body tensed. "We will retrieve her after the estate is settled. She is ours. She comes with us." "And is old?" Another pause, shorter. "She stays." Caspian's hands had formed fists at his sides without his deciding to close them. "She was always just the mechanism," Delilah continued. "She served her purpose. We are not taking her. She will go to the state." "Yes." The word was said with such complete indifference that Caspian felt it like a physical thing. "Like Marcus," Thaddeus said. "Marcus Inglerth was careless on our end," Delilah said, and her tone shifted slightly. The specific shift of someone correcting a misconception. "The dosage was too accelerated. It drew attention we were not prepared to manage. But it was ruled a cardiac event. Eventually, after more scrutiny than I was comfortable with, I have refined the approach since then." "Richards was cleaner," Thaddeus offered. "Significantly. He had an existing cardiac history, which simplified everything. The coroner's findings were exactly what we needed them to be. Natural causes." "Natural causes," Delilah confirmed. "No investigation, clean transfer of assets. That is the template." Caspian's back was against the wall of his own hallway, and the wall was the only thing keeping him fully upright. They had killed 2 men. The woman he had been sharing a home with, the woman he had been moving toward marriage with, had killed 2 men, and was discussing the methodology with the detached professional assessment of someone reviewing a process that had worked and needed only minor refinement. "The compound is the same?" Thaddeus asked. "The compound is the same. The delivery method varies depending on access and opportunity, but the compound itself is consistent. small amounts over an extended period, the cumulative effect on cardiac tissue is indistinguishable from natural deterioration. No standard toxicology panel identifies it. How long does it take? Administered correctly, 6 to 9 months of consistent exposure produces the necessary cardiac compromise. A triggering event, stress, physical exertion, then produces the acute event that is recorded as cause of death. And you have access. Complete access, Delilah said. I cook for him. I make his coffee. I am with him more hours of the day than anyone else in this house. So Sterling has, what, 6 months from when you start? From when I have already started, Delilah corrected. Silence. You have already begun. 3 weeks ago, the baseline doses, nothing that would produce symptoms yet, just establishing the presence in his system. By the time the will is updated and the marriage is 6 months old, the foundation will be well established. He has no idea. He has no idea. Caspian stood in the hallway and understood that he was already being poisoned, that the coffee he had drunk that morning, the meals he had eaten over the past 3 weeks, had already begun the process they were describing so casually on the other side of the door. What about the hospital situation? Thaddeus said. The nurse. Prudence Haller, Delilah said. That is resolved. She was becoming a problem. She was always going to become a problem. People with gambling debts and guilty consciences are useful for specific tasks, and then they become liabilities. We knew that going in. 100,000 was what it cost. 100,000 to perform the switch. She was 60,000 in debt at the time. The payment cleared her completely and left her with enough left over that she had reason to stay quiet. But she did not stay quiet. She started to crack about 14 months after the switch. She reached out to me, which was the mistake I had anticipated and planned for. Thaddeus managed the situation before she made contact with anyone else. Overdose, Thaddeus confirmed. Consistent with her documented history, no investigation. Caspian pressed his hand flat against the wall. The baby swap. 2 biracial girls, Delilah said. Born within hours of each other at the same hospital. I had been monitoring Serafina's pregnancy timeline for 6 months before my own delivery. When her due date moved to the week I needed, I induced 2 weeks early. To match her timeline. Both babies were in the maternity ward simultaneously. Prudence was on shift. She had access to both bassinets, both sets of wristbands. And the physical similarity. Newborns are difficult to differentiate under any circumstances. 2 biracial girls of similar size, born hours apart, the wristband and bassinet records were the only reliable distinguishing documentation. Prudence changed both. And Serafina took home my daughter, Delilah said, and I took home hers. You induced 2 weeks early just to align with her delivery. The timing was the entire architecture of the plan. If our deliveries were not simultaneous, the switch was impossible. I had one window and I used it. And Serafina never. She held that baby in the delivery room and she knew nothing. She went home and raised her for 5 years and knew nothing. And your daughter, Meadow. My biological daughter, yes. Fathered by you, raised by Serafina as Caspian's. Which is why the DNA test came back negative when they tested Caspian against her. Exactly. The negative result was the trigger for everything else. The marriage, the divorce, Caspian's vulnerability, all of it flowed from that single result. In the hallway, Caspian's understanding reorganized itself completely. Meadow, the little girl he had raised for 5 years, the child he had loved without reservation, the daughter he had done daddy braids for, and read 47 consecutive bedtime stories to, was biologically Delilah and Thaddeus's daughter. Isolde, the little girl he had believed was his, the child he had been working to connect with, the daughter he had been told had been neglected out of Delilah's human weakness, was biologically Serafina's daughter. His daughter with Serafina. Serafina had not been unfaithful. She had never been unfaithful. She had raised a child who was not biologically hers, believing completely that the child was her own. She had loved Meadow with everything she had, without any knowledge that anything was wrong, without any idea that the child she was raising belonged biologically to the woman who was systematically destroying her marriage. And while she was doing that, her own biological daughter, Isolde, had been living in poverty in that cramped apartment, sleeping on a mattress on the floor, being treated as a burden by the woman who had taken her. He had thrown away an innocent woman. He had accused her. He had ended their marriage based on evidence that was true in the most literal sense, and completely false in every sense that mattered. The anemia was a risk, Thaddeus said. A calculated one. Small doses of the compound administered to a child produce different effects than adult exposure. The aplastic anemia presentation was the outcome I was working toward. Serious enough to require hospitalization and blood typing, not serious enough to cause permanent damage. You poisoned a 5-year-old. I poisoned my own biological daughter, Delilah said, without any evident disturbance at the statement. Temporarily, for a specific purpose, the treatment worked and she recovered. And the blood typing triggered the paternity question, which triggered the DNA test, which destroyed the marriage, which created the vulnerability that brought me into position. Every step followed from the one before it. It was designed that way. Caspian stood in the hallway and thought about the bruises on Meadow's golden skin, the ashy lips, the gray cast around her eyes, the weight loss, the exhaustion that settled into her like a stone sinking through water. The morning she could not eat her pancakes, the light going out of her eyes. He had watched all of that happen. He had stood in her room with his hand on her forehead and felt the heat of a sick child and driven her to the hospital and sat in the consultation room and said, whatever she needs, whatever it costs, with everything he had. And every bit of it had been manufactured. Every symptom, every bruise, every terrifying blood result, manufactured by the woman currently on the other side of the door. His jaw tightened until his back teeth ached. So the full picture when we leave, Thaddeus said. Sterling is dead. The estate passes to you as surviving spouse. We liquidate what we can quickly and move the rest through the offshore structures. We retrieve Meadow from Vermont. Serafina will not hand her over. Serafina will not have a choice. We will have legal standing as her biological parents. The courts will move in our favor. And Isolde, state custody, Delilah said. We report that we cannot care for her. She enters the system. You are willing to do that. I have already done everything else, Delilah said simply. Isolde was never anything more than a mechanism. She served her function. I am not carrying a child across an ocean who is not mine. Caspian stood in the hallway and understood the full architectural scope of what had been done. This had not been improvised. It had not been reactive. It had been constructed over years, with the deliberate, patient precision of people who thought in long timelines and felt no instinctive resistance to the damage they caused on the way to their objective. They had taken a child from her mother. They had poisoned that child to trigger a medical crisis. They had used that medical crisis to destroy a marriage. They had positioned Delilah to enter the wreckage. They had killed 2 men to refine their approach. They had killed the nurse who helped them to eliminate the risk she represented. And now they were planning to kill Caspian, take Meadow, and abandon Isolde, a 5-year-old girl who was biologically Serafina's daughter, to the foster care system. The cruelty was not incidental to the plan. It was structural. Every part of Caspian that was capable of rage was engaged at full capacity. The desire to open that door was physical. He wanted to walk through it with the same composure he brought to every room he entered and tell them both, quietly and without heat, that the game was finished. He did not open the door, because Caspian Sterling had not built what he built by acting from his emotions when his mind was the more reliable tool. Opening the door solved nothing. They would deny it. They would reframe it. Delilah would deploy the warmth and the composure she had spent years developing, and she would construct an alternative explanation for whatever he claimed to have heard. Thaddeus would support her. It would become his word against theirs, and he was a man who had recently and publicly demonstrated poor judgment in exactly this domain. He needed evidence. He had already installed the equipment to get it. Caspian moved away from the door with the same silence he had used to approach it. Down the hallway. Down the staircase. Back through the side entrance the way he had come. He picked up the forgotten file from the study table on his way past. He let himself out. The side door closed behind him with its ordinary, unremarkable sound. The sound of a man leaving a house he leaves every morning. Nothing about his departure was visible as anything other than that. In his car, he opened the application on his phone that connected to the recording system. The devices had been running all morning. They had captured everything. The conversation from its beginning, complete and clear, every word in sequence. The quality was what his security consultant had promised when he installed it. Every confession, every detail, every piece of the plan laid out in the natural, unguarded language of two people who believed they were alone. He had all of it. Caspian put the car in drive and pulled onto the road. He gripped the steering wheel. The rage was there, enormous, structural, the kind of rage that has mass and takes up space. He let himself feel it for the length of the approach road. He gave it that much. Then he put it somewhere it would not interfere with what needed to happen next. He was a man who had spent his professional life making decisions under pressure. He understood that the decisions made from the center of emotion were rarely the most effective ones. He understood that what he was feeling right now, as legitimate and enormous as it was, could not be allowed to drive the sequence of actions that followed. He needed a plan. He had the recording. He needed lawyers. Not the family attorneys who handled his estate documents, but criminal attorneys. He needed law enforcement contacts he trusted. He needed to understand whether Meadow was safe in Vermont, whether Serafina was in any immediate danger, and whether moving too quickly would give Delilah and Thaddeus time to disappear before the net was in place. He needed to think about Isolde, his biological daughter with Serafina, the child who had been used as a mechanism by her own mother and was now facing the prospect of being left behind entirely. He needed to think about Meadow, the child Serafina had raised, the child who was biologically Delilah and Thaddeus's, but had been loved for 5 years by a woman who had no idea she was doing anything other than raising her own daughter. Both of those children needed to be protected. That was the first and non-negotiable priority. Everything else, the justice, the legal process, the full public accounting of what Delilah and Thaddeus had done, could be organized around that priority. He merged onto the highway. Traffic moved around him in both directions. Ordinary people on ordinary Thursday morning commutes, living inside their ordinary lives, none of them aware that they were sharing a road with a man whose entire understanding of the past 2 years had just been rebuilt from the foundation up. He drove at a steady speed. He kept his eyes on the road. He called his attorney from the car's hands-free system, not the family attorneys, the criminal attorney whose number he had never had occasion to use before. And he said 3 sentences. I have a recording of a murder confession, 2 murders and a plan for a 3rd. I need to meet today. While the phone rang and the highway moved under his tires, Caspian thought about the 2 little girls at the center of everything. Meadow, in Vermont with Serafina, safe for now, unaware. The child he had loved and then failed by withdrawing from her because of a lie. The child who had asked for daddy braids and gotten them even in the worst weeks, because he could not bring himself to look into her face and say no. She was not biologically his. She was the daughter of the people who had destroyed his marriage and were planning to take his life. And she was 5 years old, and she had done nothing wrong, and she had a mother who loved her completely. And she needed to stay exactly where she was. Isolde, at school right now, in the small, careful way she inhabited the world. His biological daughter with Serafina, a child who had been neglected, instrumentalized, and was now scheduled to be abandoned. She needed him. She had always needed him. He had come to her too late, for the wrong reasons, guided by people whose only interest in her was what she could produce for them. He could not undo the 5 years. But he was done allowing other people's plans to determine what happened to either of those children. Caspian knew everything now. He knew the full shape of the conspiracy. He knew who was responsible and how they had done it and what they intended to do next. He knew that he was being poisoned. He knew that too. Men before him had died from the same poison. He knew that the nurse who had helped with the baby swap was dead. He knew the escape plan. He knew that Serafina was innocent. He knew it with the complete, irrefutable clarity of having heard the people responsible explain exactly what they had done, and why, and how, in their own voices, without any awareness that anyone was listening. Delilah and Thaddeus did not know that he knew. They were, at this moment, in that master suite, believing that the morning had been like every other morning, that Caspian had gone to his meeting, that the plan was on schedule, that the gullible fool they had selected as their 7th mark was driving toward his office, with no idea what was waiting for him at home. They were wrong, and they had no idea they were wrong, which meant Caspian had something that almost never exists in a situation like this one. He had the advantage. He intended to use it completely. 300 miles north, In a bakery that smelled of sourdough and sweet potato and honest work, a woman was pulling trays from a commercial oven and thinking about what she needed to prep for tomorrow. She had prayed the night before, the way she prayed every night. For truth, for clarity, for whatever had been done in the dark to find its way to the light. She did not know that her prayer was already answered. She did not know that the man she had loved, the man she had lost, was driving down a highway with a recording that changed everything. She did not know that everything was about to change. She kept working. She kept praying. And the truth, which had been patient for 2 years, was finally on its way home. Serafina did not know any of this while it was happening. While Caspian stood in that hallway absorbing confessions that rebuilt the architecture of the past 2 years from the ground up, she was in Vermont pulling sourdough from a commercial oven and making notes about the next day's prep list. While he drove down a highway with a recording that changed everything, she was braiding Meadow's hair before school and humming a hymn her grandmother had taught her. While he sat in an attorney's office laying out the evidence that would begin to dismantle everything Delilah and Thaddeus had built, she was behind the counter of a bakery that bore her name, doing the work of surviving one honest day at a time. She was 300 miles away from the moment that was going to change her life again. She did not know it was coming. She just kept going, because that is what she had learned to do. There's something that lives at the center of this story that is worth sitting with before we move to what comes next. People wear masks. Not occasionally. Not only the obviously terrible people. People wear masks as a matter of ordinary social function, and most of the time the mask is close enough to the face beneath it that the distinction does not matter much. But some people wear masks that bear no relationship at all to what is underneath. Delilah Vance sat across from Caspian Sterling for months and deployed warmth and remorse and vulnerability as instruments of manipulation, and she was so skilled at it that a man who was fundamentally intelligent and had every reason to be cautious did not see it. Thaddeus sat at that dinner table and shook hands and made conversation and played his role so completely that the people paid to manage the household did not flag anything unusual. They were very good at what they did. But here's what good liars always underestimate. They underestimate the durability of truth. Truth does not require performance. It does not need to be maintained or managed or kept consistent across multiple conversations. It simply exists, underneath everything waiting. It is patient in ways that lies cannot afford to be, because lies require ongoing energy and truth requires none. Delilah and Thaddeus had been running their performance for 11 years, and it took one man turning around on the approach road because he forgot a file to bring the whole thing down. That is how it always happens. Not dramatically. Not through heroic investigation or brilliant detective work. Through a door left 3 inches open by people who believed they were untouchable. What is coming next is a reckoning. Not a small one. Not a partial accounting. A full, complete structural dismantling of everything Delilah and Thaddeus built. There are children to be returned to where they belong. There is a woman in Vermont who has been living inside an injustice she did not create and cannot escape on her own. There is a man who made a catastrophic mistake that he cannot undo but must now spend everything he has trying to make right. And there are 2 people who believe they are 3 steps from St. Kitts and new names and everything they planned for a decade to take. They will not get there. The reckoning is coming. And when it arrives, no one, not Delilah, not Thaddeus, not the ghosts of Marcus Inglerth and Richards and Prudence Holler, will be ready for what it looks like. Before part 2, there is a question worth sitting with. What would you do if you were Caspian in that hallway? Would you open the door? Would you walk away and call the police immediately? Would you confront them in that moment, despite knowing it would give them time to run? And what would you do if you were Serafina, still in Vermont, still unaware, still praying every night for something you do not yet know is already on its way to you? Put your answers in the comments. The conversation down there is always worth reading. If this story has been sitting with you, if something in it has felt personal or important or like something you needed to hear today, I need you to do 3 things right now. Hit that like button. It is a small action that does something significant. It tells the platform to put this story in front of more people who might need it. Subscribe and turn on your notifications so you are there when part 2 arrives. Because what happens next, the confrontation, the legal process, the moment Serafina finds out the truth about her daughter, all of it is coming, and it will leave you with a lot to think about. And share this. Send it to your group chat. Post it somewhere. Because stories like this one, about what happens when lies finally run out of road, have a way of reaching exactly the people who need them most. Thank you for being here. Thank you for staying until the end. The truth always finds its way to the light. I will see you in part 2.